Hello, scholars! My name is Dr. Kara Stillen, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In the last video, we looked at the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. In this video, we're going to look at the presidency of James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. The election of 1828 was extremely special because it was the first time in which the popular vote determined the outcome. Over 1 million voters took part in this election. It featured incumbent Republican John Quincy Adams against Democrat Andrew Jackson. To truly understand Andrew Jackson's win in 1828, it's important to know about Andrew Jackson's life history. Andrew Jackson was born in Carolina Country in 1767. His father died early, and his mother tried to raise 3 small boys by herself. At 14 years old, his mother and brothers died of disease during the Revolutionary War. Jackson began drifting around and gaining money from gambling, as well as fighting and drinking alcohol. At the age of 17 years old, something shifted. He worked and studied under a lawyer for 3 years and then moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where he became a prosecutor. It was from here that he was able to buy land as well as slaves. At the age of 29 years old, Jackson was elected to Congress and only served 1 term. 6 years later, he served as a general in the Tennessee militia and became a great military leader. It was at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815 that General Andrew Jackson became a national hero. Jackson was a man of action with quite a strong temperament. It was not abnormal for Jackson to challenge people to a duel. He was reckless at times and didn't think before he acted. He was not a man of privilege or part of the academic elite. When he lost the presidential election to John Quincy Adams, he was extremely angry and revengeful. Jackson made it his mission to win the next presidential election of 1828. Andrew Jackson was a man that was able to become someone through hard work and dedication. Many Americans saw themselves in him. He began as a regular man, but worked extremely hard. The early 1800s was a very unique time in America's history. The country was primed for innovation and an entrepreneurial spirit. The nation would greatly benefit from faster transportation and a way to ship goods more quickly from one location to another. Innovation meant money and could even make ordinary people rich. President Andrew Jackson made sure to be involved in the changes that were taking place in America. He supported some innovations while violently opposing others. Americans believed at this time that they could create and shape their own futures. In 1807, Robert Fulton introduced a steam-propelled boat which could travel from New York City to Albany in 30 hours. Now, if you travel by road, it would take 2 full days to complete this journey. Everyone wanted to travel by steamboat after this. Within a little more than 10 years, there were steamboats traveling the Great Lakes as well as up and down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. If individuals overstocked the furnace of the steamboat, though, it could cause the boiler to explode, and riders were often killed. 3,000 Americans were killed in steamboat explosions within a couple years. The federal government had to step in and regulate the safety of these boats. These boats were extremely hard on the environment, though. The ships had to stop every 20 to 30 miles and find more wood for their furnaces. And these boats caused tons of smog and air pollution. In direct competition to these steamboats were stagecoach companies. These were the fastest modes of transportation before 1815. The quickest stagecoach could travel from New York to Boston in 4 days. Americans started traveling more often and their viewpoints started to broaden. Canals were another innovation that changed transportation. Canals were shallow highways that were man-made and were about 4 feet deep and filled with water. Barges and boats were pulled by mules or horses, and they only traveled about 5 miles per hour. Luckily, 1 horse would be able to pull a 50-ton barge. One of the most famous canals was the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825. It was 350 miles long from Buffalo, New York to Albany, New York. Household goods tended to move west, while flour moved east. Passengers were able to travel these canals and go from one place to another. Those that created products and needed them shipped paid 1/10 of what they would pay if they sent them via stagecoach. It was during this point in history that New York City became the commercial hub of the nation. In the early 1840s, railroads devastated most other forms of transport. The canals stayed with freight, but individuals loved to ride the railroad. The very first railroad had a track that was only 13 miles long and was constructed in 1829. In the 1830s, there were more than 3,000 miles of tracks that were laid for the railroad. People loved to experience the transportation in which they moved inside the cars at 15 to 20 miles per hour. Industries also changed quickly within the U.S. In 1815, the two major industries were textiles and shoes. The reason why the textile industry grew was because of machinery that ran on the movement of water. These industries were built by rivers that had fast-moving water. Women were hired for very little, which meant that owners could gain more profit. By 1815, there were a little under 200 spinning mills that had been built along streams and rivers in the New England states. The employees were young women, and they didn't tend to stay long. In 1821, Bostonians created a place where all cloth production could take place. Lowell, Massachusetts, on the Merrimack River, allowed for the shrinking, spinning, weaving, and dyeing of cloth. They hired thousands of young women and ended up having to hire moral supervision for these young ladies. The young women lived in boarding houses owned by the company that made church attendance mandatory, and the women were not allowed to court men or to drink alcohol. The dorms were shut down and locked at 10 p.m., and young women were very exhausted after working 70-hour weeks for very little money. Many of these women saved the money they earned and spent a bit on themselves. They also enjoyed living away from their families and having new freedoms. In 1834 and 1836, hundreds of women in Lowell, Massachusetts walked out on strike and formed unions when mill workers sped up work and attempted to cut their wages. 4 to 6 years later, mill owners moved from young women to migrant families for workers. This was their way of dealing with young ladies that wanted to strike against them. The reason that the shoemaking industry became popular was because of the separation of tasks in the process. Now, male shoemakers cut the leather and placed the soles. They hired wives who stayed at home to stitch and bond the shoes, and they could do this in between doing their household chores. These wives helped their families to earn additional cash. Keeping women at home as workers would also cut the chance of them trying to join or create unions. By the 1830s, there were also 330 banks that helped prime the economy with loans to manufacturers and industry by offering a money supply. When money was borrowed, borrowers were given banknotes. Each bank had a different looking banknote. Essentially, they were seen as money. There was no paper money at this point, and banknotes essentially served as the nation's money. Now, if somebody wanted, they could trade in their banknotes for gold or silver. It was truly hard to stop the movement of counterfeiting, though. President Andrew Jackson used this to his advantage and played up the idea of the ordinary citizen against the powerful elite. He had also brought in new campaign tactics such as giving speeches at rallies, having banquets with citizens, as well as picnics. Jackson created Hickory clubs, the name played on his nickname, Old Hickory. He gave speeches at informal barbecues. This was much different from the other candidates who believed they were too good for this type of campaigning behavior. Political parties shifted, and in 1832, the National Republicans became the party that wanted the federal government to help with business development. The Democratic Republicans was a party that stood for all the people and not just the select few. In 1834 to 1836, the National Republicans became known as the Whigs, and the Democratic Republicans became known as the Democrats. The election of 1828 of Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams brought in sharp character attacks. Jackson used Adams' personal items like his ivory chess set and his books to show how Adams was an elitist and never really labored a day in his life. Jackson's character assassination centered around him being fatherless and an adulterer. He had married a woman whose divorce had not been legalized yet. He was portrayed as sinful and abusive. Jackson won without any problems. Before his inauguration took place, his wife, Rachel Jackson, died. The president went into deep mourning. He lost tons of weight and at 6'1" only weighed 140 pounds. Citizens were worried that he would not make it to a second term. But the crowds went crazy during Jackson's inauguration, and as he walked toward his swearing-in ceremony, the people went crazy. When he finally got back to the White House, the party was so large, people climbed through the windows of the White House and stood on furniture just to get a look at Jackson. Thousands of dollars in dishware and furniture were broken. President Jackson made sure that all people felt welcome at the White House. He installed spittoons in the East Room to make it easier for tobacco chewers that came to see him. He wanted to be seen as the common man's president. Jackson met with almost anyone throughout his 2 terms in office, but he only wanted people in the White House that were loyal to him, though. When Jackson pushed his agenda, it was one of limited government because he didn't want to see individual businesses held back by innovation. He didn't believe in charters or monopolies for rich investors. Rapid development could take place without the federal government's hand, and land sales would help to bring money to the country. Jackson wanted to create a policy that would rid Native Americans of their land so Americans could establish themselves in the rural areas. This was his definite priority. Jackson used his veto on a regular basis with Congress to make sure they knew where he stood. 20 times he vetoed legislation. The presidents that had come before him altogether used their veto 9 times total. President Jackson's priority through his presidency was relocating Native American tribes, and in 1829, he told Congress that he wanted to remove the Native Americans west of the Mississippi River so that they could no longer be a danger to Americans settling lands in that area. The conversion of the Native Americans had been unsuccessful as missionaries taught them to read and introduce the Bible. Native American women fought against assimilation as they recognized that white men oppressed women in their own culture. Native American women were seen as much more equal within their own tribes. President Jackson saw Native Americans as objects of the federal government. He really didn't want to see the Native Americans assimilate because he didn't like them. Congress eventually followed President Jackson and passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. They offered $500,000 to help relocate Native American tribes west of the Mississippi River. Blackhawk, who was the chief of the Sauk and Fox Native American tribes in western Illinois, resisted the Americans' law. He had fought with Tecumseh in the War of 1812 and wasn't about to leave his land and his people. Various bloody battles took place in Illinois and Wisconsin where differing militias followed tribes, capturing and massacring its people. Southern Native American tribes were much stronger and showed greater resiliency. Creek, Cherokee, and Chickasaw tribes fought, and the battles were even bloodier. In 1831, the state of Georgia announced that it would be seizing the property of any Cherokee individual, and this is when the tribe took their case to the Supreme Court. As the Chief Justice John Marshall stated, the Cherokee did not have the grounds to sue the state of Georgia. When 2 missionaries attempted to give aid to Native Americans in Georgia, they were arrested and their suit was brought to court. In the 1832 case of Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court recognized the Cherokee people as their own distinct community and declared their territory sovereign. This should have been enough to question the relocation of the Cherokee people, but President Jackson didn't care and ignored the Supreme Court's decision. The Cherokee were able to remain about 2 more years before their land was sold out from underneath them. Most Cherokee people stayed right where they were, and a deadline was created for them to remove themselves from the land or to be forced off of it. The deadline was May 1838. Troops arrived with weapons and forced the Cherokee people to walk 1,200 miles west in a journey that became known as the Trail of Tears. Many Cherokee people died as they walked. The Cherokee had to bury 14 to 15 people at each stop they made. When they finally arrived, there were thousands of Choctaw, Creek, and Chickasaw people that had been forced to relocate to what was known as Indian Territory. This area eventually became known as the state of Oklahoma in 1907. President Jackson was proud of relocating the Native Americans and didn't seem to care that thousands had died in the process. Once the Native American tribes had been forced from their lands, 4.5 million acres were sold. Within 2 more years, a total of 20 million acres had been sold. Southern lands were quickly bought up so that slavery could be extended and cultivation could be increased. This was the first time in the history of the nation that the national debt disappeared. Lyman Beecher, who was a preacher in the 1820s, organized the American Temperance Society. They attempted to stop various persons of the middle classes from drinking alcohol. They had people sign a pledge to stop drinking and talked some businesses into having people sign this pledge before they were allowed a job. The group became so big that it was renamed the American Temperance Union in 1836. Organizers attempted to make it illegal for persons to serve alcohol. Women especially got behind this movement. They wrote articles in newspapers condemning men who drank and went to prostitutes for their pleasure. Some groups of individuals went as far as to include the abolition of slavery within the movement. The Americans grew tired of Andrew Jackson after 2 terms and didn't want to see him win again. Martin Van Buren ran against William Henry Harrison. In 1836, the political parties now decided who they would run as their candidate. Those that opposed Van Buren tended to state that he was against slavery. Van Buren had quite a bit of a temper and definitely sought loyalists to be by his side. He had been the vice president for Andrew Jackson and had much experience as a politician. Van Buren ended up winning the election against many different people from the Whig Party, his strongest opponent being William Henry Harrison. Van Buren won by 170 electoral votes. The economy was not doing well when Martin Van Buren began his first term as president. The agricultural market was down, and economic problems were about to take place. Individual citizens panicked and attempted to get their money out of the bank. Various bonds as well as stocks fell 30% in value. President Van Buren attempted to solve the economic problems by creating a national treasury, and Congress finally agreed in 1840. Many knew the economic problems of Van Buren's presidency meant that he would not win a second term. In the election of 1840, incumbent Van Buren ran against William Henry Harrison, who was seen as a very common man. 78% of those who could vote came out to the polls. There were fake stories about how Harrison grew up in a log cabin, rose out of the ashes to become someone really great within the nation. Harrison slaughtered Van Buren and won 234 electoral votes to become the next president of the United States. All right, well, we're going to stop there. Please, if you like the video, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe so you can see the very next videos when they come out. I appreciate you watching, and thank you very much. I will talk with you soon. Bye-bye.